All right, I'm going to kick us off. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Mary Rafferty. I'm the Executive Director of the Virginia Conservation Network. If you're here, you probably already know this, but VCN, we are the partnership of the broader environmental community here in Virginia. We have a partnership of organizations made up of over 170 organizations, and we work on a wide range of issues, including land use and transportation, but also clean water and resilience, climate and clean energy, land conservation, and you're here today for land use and transportation. We are doing this as part of our Common Agenda educational series. So you may know that VCN just released our annual Our Common Agenda. If you haven't gotten one in the mail yet, you can order one on our website. And this is a comprehensive guide to what state policy looks like in Virginia around Virginia's environment. It is written by VCN's 170 network partners. It is drafted by them. It is reviewed by them. It is ultimately voted on them to be, again, the background of, why the issues that we are talking about matter, what the policy background is on those issues, what is the existing policy landscape for those issues, and what are the future opportunities? Where are we going next? And the purpose of this webinar series is to give you that information that we have published on paper, but in a more informal setting here online, for you to ask questions and to better understand them directly from the authors, the key points of context, those in the community who are doing the work over the next, hour and a half. So we are going to go ahead and get started. We have three awesome speakers today. Richard Hankins, who is the Executive Director of Partnership for Smarter Growth. Stephanie Power, the Community Engagement and Programs Manager with RVA Rapid Transit. And Brantley Tyndall, who is the Director of Bike Walk RVA. A couple of programming notes before we get started. Each of the speakers has about 10 to 12 minutes that they will be diving into the overview that they are talking about today. At the end, we're going to take questions from anybody who is interested in asking a question. So for those of you who are tuning in live, what I ask is that throughout the entire presentation, you can put any questions that you have into the chat box or into the Q&A function. And then again, we're going to answer all of those questions at the end. So, but don't hesitate to put them in. If something comes to your mind and you want to get it out right away, just feel free to plop it right on in there. That way you don't forget, or you can wait until the end and ask the questions then. We do hope to have a discussion at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'm excited to introduce Richard Hankins, the new Executive Director for Partnership and Smarter Growth, to talk about land use and housing. Richard, go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you, Mary, so much. Shall I pull up my screen?
Go for it.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. My name is Richard Hankins. As Mary said, I'm the head of Partnership for Smarter Growth, which is kind of looking for, walkable cities, attractive urban design, and at the same time, doing land conservation and preserving our green and rural spaces. I used to work at RVA Rapid Transit, and I'm delighted to see that Stephanie will be following me. So shout out to them. But I'm going to cover sustainable housing growth as part of the land use and transportation segment. So I don't think I need to explain. Housing has a profound impact on our lives. Everybody's a stakeholder. Everybody needs a place to live. Everybody is affected by the price of housing and the amount of housing supply. It shapes how we work, how we get around, our community around us. And for a lot of people who are homeowners, it's their most valuable asset. But I probably don't need to tell many folks here, we are in a statewide housing crisis that honestly extends to the entire nation. Housing is getting more expensive. We're not building enough housing. Virginia's lucky. We have a ton of jobs. But we need to build more housing to let those people live near the jobs. And what we've done, and the most textbook example is Northern Virginia, is we continue to sprawl. We have created all of these incentives to build outwards um, instead of kind of gentle density, and that um, increases car dependency, which is going to increase carbon emissions. It's going to increase financial strain from having to commute farther. And we're also losing our green spaces as well. And so not only is it important that we address this housing shortage by building more housing, the type of housing we build is really, really important. We're looking for infill housing, so that's placing housing where development already exists versus taking over our forests and agricultural lands. We're also looking for climate safe housing. We've had two devastating hurricanes happen recently, and it's important that, you know, it doesn't seem like that's going to change, that kind of risk is going to change the immediate future. So we definitely need to be cognizant of that. And we also need to build more housing by jobs. So anybody, I'm sure, commuting far out in Northern Virginia to try to get into closer into DC, not only is there a financial strain from having that large asset and the car and all that cost, but it also creates a lot of just stress on people. And we also want to incentivize something called transit-oriented development. Um, you know, Virginia, we have a lot of good transit already, but if you can't access it, if the land use isn't there, then the transit line will be permanently hampered in its utility. Oh, they got rearranged. Okay, that's fine. And so the current landscape is overwhelmingly, this has been a process. This housing shortage has not been incidental. It's been designed, it's been codified in our law through restrictive zoning, restrictive land use, and everything to incentivize sprawl and to not build the amount of housing we need. Virginia's currently in a shortage of over 105,000 housing units. And not surprisingly, just based on supply and demand, that those houses are at an all-time high. So many people are facing financial insecurity, being displaced, struggling to live close to jobs and services. And a lot of the housing, like starter homes, that were affordable a generation ago, are no longer in reach for a lot of families looking to settle down. And it affects people across the age spectrum. Almost 30% of middle income families that are 50 and older are paying over 30% of their income on housing, which is a common note of something called housing distress, of you're paying too much to be financially secure. And these local zoning codes, an overwhelming amount of our land, even in our more suburbanized and urban areas, are limited to single family detached homes, further driving up housing costs, taking up valuable land. We also have often large lot sizes, setbacks, parking requirements. And all of these can drive up the cost of housing. And we've also made building a variety of housing more challenging. There's something called accessory dwelling units, ADUs, but the fun way to call it is like a backyard cottage of where a college student may live or a grandparent looking to downsize. And we've made that very difficult to build. Some states, some cities have done some efforts to address these, but a lot of it is hampered because of the lack of state policy where we need it to be. It's not meeting the needs of non-Virginians. It's not properly protecting the environment and adapting and mitigating climate change. So there are a few opportunities that we have, four that we've really identified for this session. One, like I said before, is incentivizing and removing barriers to transit-oriented developments. I think the Silver Line in DC is a good example. A lot of cities and regions across Virginia have gone fare free or zero transit, which I'm sure Stephanie will talk about. But good land use needs good transportation, and good transportation needs good land use. So we're looking for some sort of incentives to loosen zoning regulations and eliminate parking requirements within a half mile of all bus rapid transit, light rail and metro routes in Virginia. And there's a variety of ways to do it, including having the Department of Housing and Community Development look into some sort of like grant-based incentive program to those who upzone such areas. Um, the next is accessory dwelling units. So that would be like a backyard cottage, or sometimes they're called granny flat, or sometimes kind of a carriage house. Um, we've made it really easy to build one type of house, and that's that single family detached house home on kind of a large lot size, quite a few feet back from the street. But we want to give people more freedom of housing choice and also allow people to have more freedom in what they can do with their land. So, these smaller ADUs could house a family member, it could facilitate intergenerational living, bolster community support, and it would also be another way to build wealth for homeowners, while also creating more density in certain localities without drastically changing the neighborhood character. Um, we'd also love to see more housing and job centers, and kind of converting some commercial areas into more mixed use, walkable, with more greenery, and allow people to live closer to where they work, give retail businesses a greater catchment area of people nearby who may want to shop, and also increase nearby talent for employers. And then just anecdotally, it is always nice to have a short commute. And so, removing some red tape and easing zoning regulations to allow people to live closer to work, we see as a win-win both for the economy and for the climate. The fourth thing is a play on words. Yes, in God's backyard, which is a play on the YIMBY movement, or yes, in my backyard. But we would love to see faith-based organizations like churches to be able to build housing and affordable housing on their property. Churches are already a huge backbone of the community, a huge boon to helping people find a place to get back on their feet. And for churches to be able to build housing would be a great way for the church to hopefully further their mission of giving back, and also allow us to build more housing and truly address that 105 housing units that were short in the Commonwealth. So the top takeaway, I put two, but Virginia's in a housing crisis that's getting worse, and there is nothing we're doing at a speed to really right that course. As the current status quo is, it's only going to get worse due to our restrictive zoning and land use policies. And we believe that adding density, including ADUs, infill housing, like letting churches build on our lots, will lead to a myriad of benefits, from the economy, lowering transportation costs, lowering housing costs, giving people more freedom to choose where they live, and lowering the car dependency, which Stephanie and Brantley will talk about, will lead to fewer carbon emissions. So that's what I have. So thank you guys. I love talking about this stuff. I'm looking forward to questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Richard. That was awesome.
Thank you.
So like I said at the beginning, if there are questions that you have, please feel free to put them directly into our Q&A box. You can see that at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will get to all the questions at the end. So put them in now so you don't forget them, and we will make sure to get to them once we get there. Next up, I'm really excited to introduce Stephanie Powers from RVA Rapid Transit. Stephanie has joined the team, I wanted to say recently, but now I feel like it's you've been there for a while now. So, but Stephanie has just really stepped up to become one of the leading thought leaders in the region around public transportation here in Richmond, and is going to talk about public transit from a broader perspective statewide. So, Stephanie, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mary. Let me get my screen share on. All right, can I get some thumbs up? Did that work?
We can
Awesome.
see it.
Beautiful.
It's perfect.
Looks good. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you, Mary. Thank you, Jaime, also for supporting and organizing us all. It is great to be here. And I'm grateful to have the chance to just share a little bit about um, yeah, my passion for the bus. So my name's Stephanie Power. I work with RVA Rapid Transit here in the Richmond region, and I'm the community engagement and programs manager. Basically, RVA Rapid Transit, we're a nonprofit. We advocate for frequent and far-reaching transit across the Richmond region. And we advocate for more buses going more places out into the counties, and we advocate for more shelters and benches to be installed across the transit system, and also to elevate our riders' voices so that the people who are actually riding the bus day in and day out, the experts, are really involved in making the decisions, because we know experiential wisdom is the most powerful. And then also we advocate for zero fare, and I will speak about that a little bit later too. So next slide. Okay, cool. So public transportation, why does it matter? Mobility is freedom. So public transportation has the powerful uh, opportunity to be the connective tissue of our communities. So it gives people access to the everyday essentials in life. People who perhaps, for whatever reason, can't operate a car or don't choose to not operate a car. It gives access for people to get to the essentials like housing, jobs, family, schools, hospitals, places of worship, and everywhere we might need to go in order to live our best full lives. We're hearing more and more about social determinants of health. And so that's essentially anything that's outside of like our physical bodies, our biological health, that impacts our sense of well-being and our quality of life. So whether we have good access to food resources, whether we can get to our medical appointments, or even things like financial barriers or how we experience discrimination in our lives. These all impact us as a whole. And so transportation is kind of the key to everything. Whether if we're experiencing food insecurity, for example, and we don't live within walking distance of a grocery store, public transportation has that power to get us to where we need to go. Let's see. We also, having access to good public transportation, like I said, it's an essential part of healthy living in communities. We know that bus riders are also pedestrians first. So the more people that are riding the bus, we're actually getting out and enjoying a healthier lifestyle. And we can see public transportation as just important as things like public libraries or public schools and public institutions. So my next point, good transit, better economies. When we invest in public transportation, it actually lifts us all. When we invest in transit, we are investing in people first. Yeah, so per AAA, for example, they've put out a study that the average car costs about $13,000 a year to own and to operate, with all maintenance and everything considered. So in the Richmond region alone, our yearly average per capita income is about 38,000. So that's like roughly, a little more than a third of our yearly income going to car costs if we are choosing to own and operate a car. And we know that in our Richmond region, and this is actually true for the Hampton Roads region as well, the majority of bus riders are making $25,000 or less a year. So that's an incredible extreme burden in accessing good, reliable transportation. In Virginia, 1.1 million of us over the age of 16, we may be eligible to own or operate a car, but 1.1 million of us do not have a driver's license. And that includes 26% of our people between ages of 16 and 34. So that's a big swath of the population. And so we want to make public transit reliable for these folks as well. When we invest in public transit, there's actually a return on that investment as well. So, for example, in 2022, the fiscal year 2022, public transportation generated over This is a big number, so it's fun to say. $8.9 billion in economic benefit, while it also created and sustained over 16,000 jobs across the Commonwealth. Car culture is hurting us. This is my assertion. Car culture is hurting us. So transportation, we know, is the #1 source of greenhouse gas emissions in Virginia. And that equals about 42% of our emissions. That's almost half. So that's a huge number. So to really kind of consider. So what is it going to take for us to mitigate that and to, move away from our kind of individualized car-centric culture? We know with our climate, our present climate, we've got rising temperatures, and that's impacting our public health negatively. And we at RV Rapid Transit have certainly seen this and studied this with the help of Dr. Jeremy Hoffman. We've gone out to bus stops to actually take thermal images, and we've recorded incredible data that shows that bus shelters, when they're installed, they actually can act as unofficial cooling centers along a person's commute, but they can mitigate the heat from 10 degrees, sometimes up to 20 degrees. There's a difference when a person's standing underneath a shelter with that shade that's offered. So promoting the use of alternative modes of transportation, including buses, but including also trains, bikes, e-scooters, ferries, that all contributes to lowering the vehicle miles traveled in the state, lowering our carbon emissions, and helping us reach our climate goals. A current landscape. So pandemic pangs and resilience. Through the pandemic, of course, ridership declined drastically across Virginia, and transit agencies experienced a shortfall of drivers. This, of course, caused service disruption and cuts across the state. Notably, though, riders who did continue to ride were our essential workers who didn't have the choice or the option to shelter in place. In the Richmond region, we did see, like, even as, of course, we also experienced a drastic dip in ridership, it was not as dramatic as many places across Virginia and across the country because of our strong, resilient, essential worker population who relies on transit. And we are also now seeing across the state, some different stories, varying stories about our rebounding from these shortages. Again, in the Richmond region, we are actually rebounding. We are rebounding faster than many cities across the country, which is pretty amazing. And I think zero fare is also a contributor to that. But we're not seeing that everywhere in Virginia. So let's go to the next point: ridership growth and or decline. So presently, like I was saying, in Richmond, our ridership is booming. It's incredible, actually. This year alone, if you come to Richmond and you get to ride the bus rapid transit, the Pulse system in downtown Richmond up and down Broad Street, this year alone, it serves over 6,000 riders daily. And when it was built in 2018, it was constructed to only move 3,500 people a day. So it's vastly growing outside of its initial impact. But of course, as a contrast, we've got in the Hampton Roads region, transit ridership levels have not yet recovered from the pandemic. Pre-pandemic, HRT had over 1 million monthly riders, and 4 years later, it's now just around 600,000 riders, so a little more than half of what it used to be. And my last point here, innovative climate justice solution is zero fare. And I'm very passionate about zero fare. I think it's a masterclass in equity, and it's very, very popular. So it eliminates all fares for riding the bus. And so because of that, it removes barriers to access for absolutely everyone. Anyone who wants to step on a public bus can do so with ease and efficiency, and eliminating any type of financial burden or stress that fares may present. So while it does this for everyone, considerably impacts our most vulnerable populations. So folks living under the poverty lines, people with disabilities, people on fixed incomes like the elderly or children. And like we saw earlier, a huge population of our young people do not have driver's license. So that means, what are they doing, right? They still need to have access to get around, to see their friends, to have healthy things to do when they get out of school, so that they, quote unquote, don't get into trouble, right? Just giving people opportunities to live their lives fully. Zero fare is an incredible, incredible policy for that. With climate change and, of course, more weather catastrophes, like Richard mentioned earlier, these hurricanes that we're seeing, and just more intensity of weather events happening and on the horizon. So our same populations who are benefiting the most from zero fare, our more vulnerable populations, they remain the most vulnerable populations during climate catastrophes. So that puts further strain on our healthcare systems. And zero fare, it just has this incredible trickle up social justice effect, right? When we can take care of our most vulnerable populations first, and we put in place policies that make sure people's needs are met, then it impacts everyone, because anyone who wants to get on that bus doesn't have to pay. So it benefits all of us. And that's a little extra money in our pockets, no matter who we are. And then I just want to say, as of January 2024, 8 transit agencies across Virginia were zero fare. And I don't know exactly where that number is today, but I think it's fairly similar. So we'll go on to opportunities. What we love to say at RV Rapid Transit is to just encourage you to get involved, ride the bus. Like if you don't ride the bus, maybe, I'm sure many of you do, but if you don't and you haven't, especially as zero fare is coming to a community near you, hopefully, take advantage of it. See what it's like. Get used to maybe stepping outside of your comfort zone if you are more of a car-centric, or your lifestyle just needs a car more and more. It can be really interesting. I know people, for example, who choose every Sunday to be their car-free day. Yeah, so they decide to, and they say that it gets them out into their community more. They get to meet more people. You get to meet the people who are living beside you, and maybe you don't talk to anyone, and you just have the experience of somebody else doing the driving. So I encourage everyone to go out and ride the bus. Add microtransit. So this is something that in the last several years, agencies across Virginia have been taking advantage of. And microtransit is essentially door-to-door service within a set zone, and typically in a more rural zone, a place that doesn't have enough maybe demand for a fixed route service to be implemented. So instead, microtransit comes along, and you can call a number and the bus will pick you up exactly where you are within that zone and drop you off where you need to go within that zone. And so we have seen this be quite successful. Again, in the Richmond region, we have 5 operating microtransit zones with a couple more on the way. And some places like Ashland, or a place like Goochland County, for example, which has never before seen public transportation. So it's quite an amazing opportunity for them. And we also see in the Charlottesville area, microtransit being added, as well as in Wise, Norton County. And expand funding. So we know also, as ridership is increasing, costs are rising. Fuel costs are rising pretty dramatically. Capital costs are rising. And in the Richmond region, again, is, one of the reasons I think GRTC, that's our Greater Richmond Transit Company, rebounded so well from the pandemic, is they made a very concise effort to pay their operators more. So they gave their operators a huge increase in pay, from like 17 an hour to 24 an hour. And so they were able to attract people to come and operate the buses, so they were able to expand their service. But of course, this all costs money, right? So we need the opportunity for really advocating for dedicated streams of funding for public transportation. The time is now. And then enhance regional and statewide partnerships, which kind of expands my previous point about funding. So the opportunity right now is to collaborate on creative and like I said, dedicated funding streams to uplift public transit. And a great example is the Central Virginia Transit Authority, which was implemented in 2020. And that brought together 9 regions, 9 localities across Central Virginia. And through that collaboration, we are seeing, like, this is really the reason why microtransit is becoming so available in our Central Virginia region, is because of this dedicated stream of funding that we know is going directly to public transportation. Yeah, so it's and it gives the opportunity for some of our silos to be broken, right? So we get regions speaking with one another. Public transportation can also go across county lines, of course. So with as we modernize together, we can synchronize together and we can collaborate on how we can uplift one another's specific transit needs. And top takeaway, I have no idea how I am on timing, but I hope we're good. So top takeaway, I said this earlier, but really when we invest in transit, we invest in people and planet. Yeah. So, and I want to think of people not as just like the people who need it the most. Of course, they're so important because we are all very important, right? But it's everyone. It's literally all the health of our communities, because when we all have our needs met and taken care of more and more, that's when we are individually healthier, and as families healthier, and as communities healthier. Crime rates go down, um, uh, quality of life goes up. And we want to think not just for ourselves too, right? But for our future generations. So when we invest in public transportation, we're investing in the future as well. And so I think real social barriers can be overcome, and also environmental goals reached. And yes, good public transit can move us all where we need to go. So thank you so much for your time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Really appreciate that. Always appreciate the work of RVA Rapid Transit, because I myself take the number 5 into the office every day, and always so appreciative of that every 15-minute free bus route. Let's see. Next up is Brantley Tyndall of Bike Walk RVA, who Brantley of many hats. I feel like whether you are trying to walk somewhere safely or bike somewhere for purpose or just for fun, Brantley is the one trying to help make it easier for you to do so across the Commonwealth. So Brantley, I'm going to kick it over to you to talk about walkable, bikeable communities.
Wonderful. It's great to join you this afternoon. I'm Brantley Tyndall with Sports Backers and the director of our Bike Walk RVA program, and also the president of Virginia Bicycling Federation. I think you're going to hear a lot of similarity with my presentation as Richard and Stephanie's points. But biking and walking need to be at the forefront of our discussion around land use and transportation in the environmental world, because, as Stephanie mentioned, the transportation sector in Virginia year after year is the single largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, as reported by the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality. The most recent year that was reported was 42%, which is literally double the energy sector at 21%. I think from like a public perception standpoint, transportation doesn't get that level of scrutiny as like solar and coal kind of generate a lot of interest in the public mind's eye. Not to say that those are not important. I don't want that to be conveyed at all. But transportation, I think we sort of take for granted, and the the opportunities for changing our transportation regime are manifold, and no system is going to work that doesn't allow people to walk somewhere. You have to walk to transit, you have to walk to work, you have to walk to various parking lots. Everyone is a pedestrian, even if you primarily drive. So the scale and scope of transportation in general in Virginia is worthy of inquiry. I will say 42% is the percentage that transportation generates greenhouse gases in Virginia. The national average is 28%. So there's something that we're doing wrong, and we really need to catch up. We can think of some of our multimodal centers in Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads and Richmond, where perhaps some zip codes are not as heavily reliant on car travel and other kind of single occupant fossil fuel based modes. But we have a long way to go if we're going to bring our transportation percentage down. Alternatives to this fossil fuel-based transportation model have to be front and center of how we're going to achieve our climate goals. If we just continue to rely on car-oriented transportation and all of the development that makes that possible in terms of highway widening, road expansion, suburban development that makes destinations too far from each other to make biking and walking and transit feasible for wide swaths of our populations, we're going to have a hard time reducing that percentage. And this matters to all of us because we all spend the money to make this possible. The taxing that makes transportation funding at such a high level is literally, I mean, we pay for funding out of our pocketbooks, the funding transportation. The annual budget for the Virginia Department of Transportation is approximately $11 billion every year. That's a significant investment. And do we think that we can make big changes by taking a strategic approach of how we can change how we spend that money? I would argue that we can. What is our current landscape of biking and walking as it relates to greater transportation? In the U.S., and this number has been pretty solid for the past several years. Most trips in the U.S. are pretty short, and it's many people may sort of bias their thinking about transportation that it's all related to your commute, and that someone may say, "Oh, I can't bike or walk or take some other form of transportation to work because it's a half-hour drive and there aren't any other options, and many things aren't very flexible. So, like, if I have to leave at a certain time to get there, driving is my only real option." But the reality is that we take many more trips than just going to work. The national average is about 8 trips a day per American. Going to the grocery store on the way home or taking your kid to school, each of those is a trip. And there's ways to reduce your reliance on cars to reduce some of those trips, but not having it be all of them. And it's simply not going to be possible unless we build systems and infrastructure that make it safe and comfortable for people to make that choice more times throughout the day or throughout the week. And just to see that half of all trips are shorter than 3 miles is, does that ring true to you? Are most of the destinations in your life pretty close to your house or pretty close in a node around your job? Like, where do you go to the grocery store? Where do you take your kids to school? Typically, those are in a node somewhere related to where you live or to where you go to work. To be able to take a bike trip for one of those, even if you still have to drive to work or if you drive at work because of what your job requires, we can definitely start choosing more of these kinds of trips. And I like the one about trips that are shorter than a mile because we think about the first mile, last mile, essentially requirement to get people to transit and both bus and rail transit. If you can't get to the bus station, even if that bus station is pretty close to you, or your bus rapid transit transfer center or your train station, it might be able to give you a really reliable trip. But if you're still driving there, you might just drive the rest of the way, and it doesn't make it a reasonable choice for your daily transportation needs. So that's sort of a landscape of the kind of trips that we're working with. But unfortunately, because of 80 years of highway development and road widening, pretty much nationwide, but certainly in Virginia, transportation is quite deadly. It's the number of people who die in the U.S. every year is on par with gun violence. About 41,000 people estimated in 2023, and about 20% of those nationally were people biking and walking, or who we call vulnerable road users. And these bicyclists and pedestrians include a lot of other users, scooter users, people in wheelchairs. These are sort of catch-all codes for the big data of capturing these transportation fatalities. And obviously, over the past few years, the micro mobility kind of universe has expanded dramatically. But we've seen that 20% is a an increase in terms of the ratio of people biking and walking who've been killed, and it's a tragic high number to hit in terms of 8,500 people didn't make it home while they were biking and walking. In Virginia, the numbers are relatively similar. 2022, we actually hit a 20-year high water mark with over 1,000 people killed on Virginia roads. In 2023, was reduced about 10% to 908, according to the Virginia DMV. 148 of those were biking and walking, about 16%, and 15% is the threshold that localities and states are incentivized to stay under. If you are above 15%, you are on essentially the naughty list with the US DOT, and you're required to spend more of your transportation funding on biking and walking because it is a significant contributor to your overall traffic fatalities. We are almost always in Virginia, year after year, above that 15% threshold. And according to the Virginia Department of Motor Vehicles, who really is the clearinghouse of this kind of information in Virginia, the two biggest trends that increase seemingly year after year are those related to speeding. And there, in the transportation world, there is a distinction between speed and speeding. Speeding is, by definition, exceeding the posted speed limit, and speed is the actual moving speed. So a road that has a high posted speed limit, someone could be driving at an unsafe speed legally, and that would not necessarily be captured in this data point. And it's a fine line that we walk in the transportation world because, generally speaking, the speed limit doesn't really matter. It doesn't drastically change how people drive. People drive based on how the road is designed and how comfortable they feel they can move through a particular built environment. And many of those fatalities that are related to how fast the car is going may not actually be counted in the way that we evaluate our performance. It's unfortunate that high speed limits may actually, or the speeding related number could actually be much higher if it was about the more absolute speed. But we've seen more than 10% increase in speeding related and pedestrian related fatalities and or crashes year after year for several years. So how do we fix these problems? Some of the main things that have been brought up from a legislative standpoint over the past few years: speeding control. How do we get in control of how people drive in our shared public space in the built environment? Over the past several years, taking police officers out of the equation more often has been the trend that in the wake of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and the number of like highly publicized, controversial police-involved traffic crashes or traffic stops has influenced the way we think about our role managing speed on our roadways. And this is paralleled with most of our police forces across the state have vacancies. So they don't have as much staff as they did 5 or 8 years ago. And the police departments at various levels are looking for tools that don't require a police officer to pull people over. That's paired with, generally speaking, looking at statistics from around the country, better statistics in terms of behavior change, driving behavior change, as well as the outcome of the interaction with the police. Essentially, if there is no interaction with the police and you get mailed a ticket, the opportunity for police brutality is essentially nil. And then what you've also seen in recent research is that the police cameras are also much fairer in that they actually pull people over or ticket people much closer to the reflective demographics of an area instead of targeting an individual kind of person. These are things that are super important for just social justice. But the current law only allows speed cameras to be used in school and work zones at limited hours. So for the past several years, the expansion of speed cameras has been a focal point in the bike ped safety community because of how effective they are, not at just reducing speeding, but in improving crash survivability and crash reductions. Traffic calming is also really important. That's just changing the built environment in our roads so that they discourage speeding. Again, the most significant factor for whether a crash will be fatal is how fast the car is going. And if you're a vulnerable road user, person biking or walking, you're not armored, you're not protected in any way, you're often hit at a very compromising angle. And the best way to save people's lives, other than dedicated infrastructure, is to reduce speeding. And there's a great way to do that by narrowing lane widths, controlling intersections in ways other than like yield signs and green lights. And there's a whole toolbox of different tools that can be used to reduce speeding very effectively. And in Richmond, after a number of high-profile pedestrian fatalities, including the tragic loss of Sean Suarez, who was a VCN staff member and someone we worked with for a long time, Richmond got pretty aggressive at installing speed humps throughout the city that have shown massive improvement in behavior change in terms of speed reduction and crash prevention. So we want to see much more drastic use of those and very strategically where people are walking and where localities are seeing higher than average injury rates in traffic. So in the city of Richmond, as one example, but localities around Virginia are doing this. The mapping high injury networks is crucial for basically being strategic about where you implement traffic calming. And just recently, VDOT released its it was formerly called the PSAP. It's now called the PBSAP. The Pedestrian Bicyclist Safety Action Plan is essentially a statewide map of where those kinds of improvements could be strategically made. And then, of course, bike and pedestrian infrastructure is essential for actually improving people's real safety and perceived safety in space that's shared with cars moving at all kinds of different speeds. Somewhat high profile in the past few years, Virginia has established a state trails office with approximately $89 million of general fund money to build trails in a regional multimodal transportation-oriented trails. Where they have been built prior to this funding, the W&OD Trail and the Virginia Capitol Trail being two of the most well-known in Virginia, you see hundreds of thousands and millions of people using them. There's a single trail counter in Roslyn, Virginia, that's at the confluence of the W&OD and Custis Trails and the Mount Vernon Trail. Gets 3.5 million users a year. That's just one particular counter. And if you build those networks that have access to housing and access to transit networks and are placed in transit and trail oriented areas where you've got a density of housing, a density of destinations like jobs and services, people will actually use them to great effect. And we can actually achieve lots of goals, both safety and climate oriented, by building trails with well-rounded strategies. And at the end of the day, one of the main reasons why people don't bike and walk is that we have a shared perception that it's dangerous. But that's a policy decision that we've built our roads for many decades to move cars very quickly, and we are seeing the anticipated side effect, which is we, as biking and walking people, as humans in our shared built environment, we share space with dangerous high-speed moving heavy objects, and we're not surviving it. So in order to solve this problem, we need to both build more dedicated space for people biking and walking, but also recognize that it takes more than just sidewalks and trails and bike lanes. We need to get vehicle speed under control and limited so that it works better for everyone. And that's what I've got.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brantley. Really appreciate your presentation. Total personal note, I took my kids this weekend to walk along the James River Trail at the pump house. And it was one of those less than a mile trips. It was over the weekend, less than a mile trips, and used borrowed a friend's e-bike, and we used the new dedicated bike lanes on the Carillon so that we could get down to the pump house. So I am a nervous biker. I don't like biking in the city that much. And thanks to dedicated bike infrastructure, I was able to take, instead of taking my car to bring the kids down to trail at the river, was able to take an e-bike. So just one of those small examples of how infrastructure helps. All right, so we have opened it up for Q&A. So there's a couple of questions in here that I'm going to start to ask, but would certainly encourage those of you who are on to ask more questions if you have them. I know there was a lot to take in there, and really appreciate our speakers thus far for the questions that or for the information that they've given us. So this first question is for you, Richard, and Judith asked, okay, Richard, cool, nice wish list, but what can actually be done quickly on the housing front? You know, just a minor question that, you know, the presidential candidates are trying to answer, let alone all the mayoral candidates and other candidates that are running for office all across the country. I do want to mention quickly, this question specifically asks, like, maybe it's a general assembly, maybe there's bills in work. The purpose of this event is really to make sure that people are educated about the background of the issues right now and to understand the general policy concepts that are out there. It is not to advocate for or against specific pieces of legislation. We will do that at VCN's legislative preview, which is the first Saturday of December. But perhaps, Richard, just to give Judith a little bit of an insight, you can let her know any quick details that you might have or specifics, things that might be a little bit more detailed.
Yeah, thank you, Judith. It's a good question because there's no point in asking for things that make no, you know, have no political viability. Or it's, you know, it's good to be pragmatic is the better way to say that. So there's two bills happening right now. One is the Faith in Housing bill. PSG is part of the Commonwealth Housing Coalition, and there we're having kind of internal discussions on the type of bill we want to either streamline permitting or doing other zoning modifications for faith-based organizations. I know Senator Hashmi is working on that as well. There's also another bill that didn't make it into this paper, but the single stair bill. So Senator Van Valkenburg got a study passed last year. And essentially, it would allow us to go up to 6 stories with just one staircase instead of, I think, the current 2 or 3. And the exciting thing about that is the staircase actually can add, that second staircase can add so much money that it makes a lot of small scale apartment buildings and condos really unfeasible for developers, like math-wise. And then all of a sudden, these gigantic 5/1s are kind of, I'm sure, you know, some people call them soulless apartment buildings, which add housing supply, which is good, but are not very attractive, don't add much to urban design. So I'd keep an eye out for those 2 bills. And then also, I think, like, I know this is more like a left-leaning space, but I think there's a lot of bipartisan stuff on housing of like the Youngkin's agenda. Like, we want to cut red tape. It is too hard to build. And that's not good. And Virginia's lucky. Our proximity to DC, our good jobs, all of that. So we should like stop getting in our own way. And it's good for the economy. If you build more housing where development already is, you could either provide more services or lower the relative tax base per property owner. So I think looking at it as a climate solution, but also looking at it as an economic solution, because that is the GA we live in right now. So I hope that helps.
Awesome. Thank you, Richard. Stephanie, this next question is for you also from Judith, who is also in favor of zero fare. As am I, no longer have to figure out to have the correct amount of quarters in my pocket. I'm somebody that could afford to ride the bus, but was always confused in different places where I am. Like, do I need a card? Do I need quarters? What do I need? So anyways, in Hampton Road, so this has been kind of, you were kind of specifically talking about how it's worked in Richmond. You know, is there more of an opportunity to bring something like that to the Hampton Roads area? Also, microtransit, like how does somebody even go about advocating or getting microtransit or knowing if there's microtransit in the area? So just if you could talk a little bit more about how kind of zero fare and microtransit kind of came to be, and how somebody can, you know, kind of bring those types of solutions to the area that they live in.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question, Judith. So my initial, thought is, okay, so zero fare basically came about because we received the TRIP grant, right? So federal funding during the pandemic that helped alleviate fares, specifically during the pandemic, but it was it had a tapering effect. So basically that money is running out. And there are lots of ways to maybe answer this question. How could you advocate? I think, first of all, in Hampton Roads, I'm not as familiar with. However, I think I did mention that in Hampton Roads, yeah, I did see data that 50%-ish of your riders make less than $25,000 a year. So I would arm myself with really important and impactful data like that in order to advocate directly to my transit agency. So also, the other key thing to know about fares is that for most transit agencies, and certainly in Virginia, fares don't actually bring in very much revenue for a transit agency. So I think if we look at Blacksburg, for example, they permanently eliminated fares because they saw that they were only bringing in $50,000 a year for their system. Yeah. And that was like about 1% of their total, the money that they were bringing in. GRTC in Richmond it's a bigger system, so the scale is relative. But similarly, our transit agency here is not interested in implementing fares because they actually add more burden sometimes than they do bring in revenue. So, there's costs for collecting the fares and maintaining the fare boxes themselves. There's actually there's of course coins. We use the physical money to pay for fares, but then there's the online way of paying for fares as well. So it can get very convoluted and complicated, and that all costs money to actually process. And then it's the added weight of it slows down your service. Every time a new person gets on the bus, you have to essentially, not just collect fares, maybe help someone if they need help. And then also it puts onus on bus operators to police fares too, which can create even more stress and strain and slow the process of the system down. So if you look at it, if you kind of collect some data like this, how much do fares actually bring in Hampton Roads? What is my population of riders? What do they look like? And who could actually really tremendously benefit from zero fare? And how could the service itself benefit from zero fares? I would amass that information, like a lot of homework, right? I would also say this is why having a transit advocacy group is really helpful. I just did a quick search. I don't think Hampton Roads has one, but I'd be happy to talk with you more, Judith, or anyone else later to share more of our experience, because also with RVA Rapid Transit, like we like I said, we bring the rider's voice into the transit agency directly. So I think that had a lot to do with why we were so successful with zero fare here. Our staff actually gathered critical feedback from riders about how zero fare was changing their lives for the better, and brought those comments directly to the transit agency. So your transit agency should have a public comment period at their board meetings. Go. Let's talk about it. Get to know them, who's on the board, that type of thing. So it's like, and those, I think we also said, what was it, like 600,000 riders a month in Hampton Roads, Judith? So who can you collaborate with? Who also, like, I'm sure people would love zero fare, right? So who can you build power with and start a campaign, maybe? That's what I would say. And then microtransit, kind of similarly, like get to know the transit agency and who sits on the board and show up and start to make your comments and then see who else would like microtransit and yeah, collaborate together. That's the best I could say right now.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Stephanie.
Mm-hmm.
Brantley, this next question is for you. It was submitted ahead of time as folks registered. How, how can we just like this idea of active transportation and everything that you are kind of talking about? We do tend to, and this was alluded to in a couple of presentations, live a little bit in a car-centric kind of way. And so how to the general public, to policymakers, to leaders in our community, how do we increase the visibility? How do we talk about, how do we make this kind of active transportation something that people are just talking about more readily, and share the types of information that you kind of brought up today? How do we just increase the visibility of all this work?
I'll start by sharing a synthesis of some surveys that have been done around the country, including in Richmond, usually at the graduate student level. If you ask the general public, what kind of cyclist are you? You find people essentially in four categories. There'll be people who say, I'm strong and confident. They'll ride in any kind of environment. You might picture in your head someone wearing athletic gear and a snazzy helmet and like matching socks and sunglasses, and like that's like an archetype, right? And we might have called the Lance Armstrong wannabes years ago, but I think he's kind of fading out of our memory a little bit. Then there are people who are interested but concerned that they would ride more if the built environment was more conducive to it, that there were more bike lanes, calmer streets, that the wayfinding and signage in your community indicated where you should be and what the reasonable behavior is as someone biking and walking. And it could be as simple as like routes to schools and routes to business commercial districts. I skipped over one, the enthused uh, I'm blanking on the word. One tier down from strong and confident, enthusiastic, people who will ride on Saturdays and Sundays to go to like the farmers market, or they'll sign up for a fun ride, charity ride occasionally, but they don't ride very much other than in big groups because they feel safe in big groups. And then there are the no way, no how, people who are either physically unable to ride bikes, or they are ideologically opposed, or they just don't see themselves being a bike kind of person. The biggest percentage out of all those is the interested but concerned. More than 60% of people in any large population sample would ride more for transportation and for recreation if it was just safer to do so. And it was a little less of a decision burden. Like, how am I going to do this? And what's the best route? And do I have the right equipment? And did I remember to pump my tires up? Or what do I do if something goes wrong? That's the majority of people. And when most of our trips are 3 miles or less, and a third of our trips are 1 mile or less, that's a great opportunity for reaching the general public with the bike lanes, like you mentioned, Mary, on Blanton and Park Avenue in Richmond. 10 years ago, nobody was thinking about bike lanes in that area, and now that we have them, it's a whole new open door for people to get to Pump House or the James River Park system, the Carillon, John B. Carey Elementary School right there. So yeah, I think it's also important when you're building in these networks, and I didn't talk a lot about the development of active transportation networks. I talked about trails, which is kind of it's a relatively hot topic because of the recent funding from the General Assembly, but we're talking about significant, relatively expensive projects, but we're talking about like spine projects for people biking and walking. I liken them to interstates, even though some kind of turns some people's stomachs to do that. But you think about like they are major investments in high production value, um, dedicated space for people biking and walking, and off of them should come spurs and bike lanes that get you to major destinations. The Fall Line in Virginia is a great example. The WNOD Trail and Mount Vernon Trail in Northern Virginia, very similar. I think you're going to see this model being implemented over the next 10 years, where 20 years ago, no one was really having this conversation. 20 years ago, we were trying to defend just a couple of arrows on the ground and that otherwise did nothing. This constant evolution of the design of active transportation is essentially a roadway network for people biking and walking that overlays our existing car-oriented network. And in some cases, redesign of places that have been car-oriented for a very long time. So that you can actually go places, so that the bike lane doesn't end, the trail doesn't end, and you find yourself in like a hairy spot, moving quickly around fast-moving cars. As soon as you start getting these connections to schools and universities and job centers and business districts and churches, and you can get on the network from a quarter of a mile from your house, you'll actually use it. And that's sort of the safety in numbers model that we've been chasing for a long time, which is we need a critical mass of people actually riding to be able to get the rest of people doing it. It's like, how many people did it take to buy an iPhone before smartphones became the normal? There's a pretty mappable innovation trend about where people are on making the choice to do something, and we're trying to mainstream it. And the way you do it is you build that infrastructure everywhere people need to use it.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Brantley. Yeah, it's so much about just seeing it, right? We talk about that with solar. If we get more solar up on rooftops, if we put them on schools, if we put them on transit centers, places that people are in and around and about, then people are going to be talking about them more often. I would just also encourage you, if you are somebody that hasn't, uses active transportation a lot, to bring along a friend or a policymaker or a whoever. The whole reason I took the trail that I did this weekend is because my friend was like, hey, let's bring the kids down. I've got an extra e-bike and there's this really cool new dedicated bike lane that I want to check out, and I think you'll love it and you'll be great. Otherwise, I would have driven. So anyways, bring people along, whether it's your local city council member or local elected official, or whether it's your friend who falls in that category of a little anxious but would do it if there was more infrastructure in place, like me. Richard, this next question is for you, and Courtney, I'm going to try and get this right, but I don't know if I can state it directly. So the question is, are there any talks to include options for congregations with less financial pull to participate in housing solutions if the willingness is shown? So I think the question here is like, yeah, what are there any resources available if there are congregations who do want to participate in identifying more ways that they can get more housing near and around them?
Right. So Courtney, if I understand correctly, we were thinking like it would be directly on the property that the churches own already. So we weren't imagining like additional property, but where they are already. And yes, one of the bills that we're working on with the Commonwealth Housing Coalition, we would be looking for $5 million for a pilot program to kind of assist the faith-based communities who want to explore and kind of navigate like the pre-development costs. And then separately, there would be $5 million from another state agency to make sure that the infrastructure, sewer lines, power, all that is ready to go for that increase. So I hope that helps.
Awesome. Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I would just also say there's a ton of organizations that work specifically with faith organizations in order to kind of help them identify these types of opportunities. So Interfaith Power and Light is a fantastic organization. And then Faith Alliance for Climate Solutions. IPL is based here in Richmond, and Faith Alliance for Climate Solutions is based up in Fairfax. Both of them kind of have statewide reach. So I would encourage you to check out those organizations if you are part of a congregation and do want to figure out how to get your congregation more involved in any of these issues. I think housing is a good example of an issue that is very cross-cutting, and you could see a congregation wanting to get more engaged in. Awesome. I believe I'm going to ask you this question, Richard, although I might think that we might punt this question to next week. But do you have any information on energy efficient initiatives in housing development? I know that tends to fall in our climate and clean energy space, which we do have that webinar coming up next week, same time. but just the following week. But Richard, I'll just ask you the question just in case you have a couple of things that you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, I do have a couple, so thank you. And it's a great question. So I'm not so focused on building codes. There are people much smarter than me that can do that. I'm focused on supply side, but also, in writing this paper, we found that single family housing can typically use about twice the energy of living in multifamily housing. And then also, if we put houses closer to transit lines and where people need to go to work and where it's easier to do some of these trips less than 3 miles and 1 mile, as Brantley mentioned. Like we're not asking, like this paper isn't specifically asking for a higher standard of housing, but it can basically re-incentivize people to then use a lot less carbon to get around. So I think part of that is where I think it is relevant to that talk, and like the building code clean energy side probably would be also relevant for next week.
Awesome. Yes, but tune in next week, same time. All right. I'm going to ask this question slightly amended to all of our panelists to wrap us up. So y'all can start to think of your answer. You probably see the question here. The question is how can individuals and businesses support a better transit system? But I'm going to ask that to all of you, but on your particular issue. So how can individuals and businesses support more dense housing that builds walkable and bikeable and livable communities? How can individuals and businesses support more active transportation infrastructure for safe walking and biking? And I will start with you, though, Stephanie. How can individuals and businesses support a better transit system?
Sure. So what's coming to my mind right now about businesses is, so one, businesses can just kind of make themselves like connect with the bus system, with the transit system a little bit more. Understand that bus riders are your customers and are like helping to move goods and services throughout your community. So with that in mind, in Richmond, for example, we have kind of a shortage of bathrooms for bus operators. So one thing that a business could do is say, like, put a little sign in your door that says, "Hey, are you a bus operator? Come on, you can use the bathroom on your break anytime." Something like that. Really to kind of put that nod to like the incredible community service that being an operator is. And then for individuals, and I mean, as well as businesses, they could do this too. But I always say ride the bus. We already talked about that. But we also can like get more connected, say with, we've got a program at RVA Rapid Transit called Adopt a Stop. And you can, if you are an individual, if you're a family, if you're a sports team or a congregation, if you're a group, whoever, you can adopt one or as many bus stops as you like. And you essentially just go out and make sure it's clean. There's a shortage of, like I said, shelters and benches as well as trash cans, so amenities at bus stops. And if more of us kind of pitch in to just say, hey, I really value this service and I value my community, so I'm going to take the initiative to go out and clean up a stop once a month. That's like an amazing way to just, again, it's like then we build relationships, right, with the people that we meet. And, there can sometimes be a stigma around riding the bus. And that's how we melt stigma too. So those are my answers.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephanie. Richard, I'm going to have you go next, and then Brantley
Yeah.
will have you wrap up.
Yeah, definitely +1 to everything Stephanie said. If you're in Richmond, email her, Adopt a Stop. It's a lot of fun. You get your name on a sign or a pseudonym if you prefer that. And if you're a business, it's free advertising. I think for me, for individuals, you can do it with Google Maps. I would like next time you go on a commute, like look at the difference in transit versus driving. It may surprise you. It also may be like 2 hours versus like 18 minutes or something. And I would just kind of sit there with that thought and, ask yourself, like, what does that mean if I don't have a car? How does that impact my quality of life, and what can be done about it? So really reckon with what it would mean to not have a car and still need to go to X or Y destination. For businesses, one thing I try to do living along a pretty transit-rich corridor is the businesses sometimes will like tell you how to get there, and they'll only be highway directions. And I say, okay, yes, but also can you mention the transit connections? And I think it's, there's anything malicious happening, but I think, having the bus show up as an option in more places and kind of, keep reminding you where it's available, I think that's good. And then also, my friends who do live along good transit corridors, I basically become very annoying and keep encouraging them to take the bus until they do, and then they realize they don't have to pay. And then like one friend doesn't take it that often, but his car broke down, so he was able to take it to and from the mechanic. Um, and just, kind of introduce to them what it could mean for their quality of life.
Awesome. The bring a friend model, that's what we're going to call that. All of us are going to bring a friend to do some busing or active transportation coming out of this. All right. Finally, Brantley, what can individuals and businesses do?
Studies around the country suggest that local businesses that have like street frontage, like cafes you may walk in, local shops, benefit greatly from having transit access and having bikeable, walkable access. If you're on a calm street versus having a street that is loud and fast-moving traffic all the time, you're much more likely to stop for an impromptu, what do they call it? Impulse buy, or to like kind of factor having a local business into your day-to-day life. Like it's just easy to hop down, go to the restaurant in the evening, as opposed to making it a big trip where you've got to find parking, and it ends up being like you end up talking yourself out of it because you feel like it's going to be challenging to do that. Businesses that are accessible from biking networks in particular, that have bike parking, that have slower speeds, tend to generate a lot more local foot traffic, and that's what makes local businesses thrive. So I think from a local business standpoint, supporting what your locality is doing to develop those kinds of improvements for people biking and walking and arriving by transit, they have outsized voices in an advocacy world. Like local businesses get the ear of local decision makers because local decision makers don't want to be on the bad side of local businesses. But I want to think like there's a whole other business world, which is biking, walking, and transit are amenities for employees, and employers are always trying to attract new talent. And if you are in a high quality of life area, you're much more likely to get higher or more talented employee recruits, and also they'll stay longer. And talent attraction is super important, but talent retention is literally a bottom line issue. It is a cost to your business if you can't keep people. And if people can't easily get to your business by biking, walking, or transit, or like if you look in downtown Richmond, CoStar is a good corporate example where their proximity to the James River, which has great biking and walking, it has access to hiking and mountain biking, and like really the epicenter of our outdoor recreation world in downtown Richmond, that affords them great talent attraction, and they're doing great, So from like it's my job as an advocate, and I think Richard and Stephanie are in the same boat. We need to have great connections with those kinds of employers because we have an amenity to offer as in our advocacy work, and we need to work hand in hand to make those connections realized.
Awesome. Well, once again, I just want to thank Brantley, Richard, and Stephanie for joining us today. Your presentations were fantastic. I love this stuff and am always jazzed to be able to sit in and listen in. And, I just want to just raise up a lot of the things that have already been said today, but just highly encourage you to talk to others about what it could look like if we built communities that were easier for us to walk, bike, and bus within and around. And whether that's your neighbor or your friend or your policy, your decision maker in your community, these are the conversations that need to be had, and sometimes aren't had as much in our broader environmental space. So appreciate folks joining us in order for us to raise the visibility of this pretty critical piece of the work that we do, and why it's so important for our climate work and our environmental work overall. I'm going to hand it over to Jaime on the VCN team, who is going to wrap us up with a couple of quick resources and upcoming events so that you can continue to stay plugged in with VCN. Jaime, can I pass it over to you?
Sure. Thank you, Mary. And I'd like to once again thank our speakers today for providing their expertise and their insights for today's webinar. So moving forward, now that you've gotten to learn about a few of the key or emerging issues facing Virginia, what's next? So I'd like to highlight our upcoming General Assembly preview. So our GA preview serves to educate environmental advocates across the Commonwealth about critical environmental legislative action coming in the upcoming 2025 General Assembly. So this year it will take place on Saturday, December 7th, so the first Saturday of December, from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. with regional watch parties across the Commonwealth, and with both in-person and virtual options. So GA Preview serves as your best chance to hear from statewide experts, meet other conservationists in your area, and learn how to get more involved on the local level all in one day. So we'll be announcing the locations of these regional watch parties in the next few weeks, so I ask that you please stay tuned. Okay. I'd also like to highlight our General Assembly Advocacy 101 webpage. So this webpage is a great resource for environmental advocates on how to strengthen your environmental advocacy. This webpage highlights upcoming events and actions, videos and guides, and an overall FAQ section on how to prepare for Virginia's General Assembly process. So in this webpage here, you can find our General Assembly 101 training videos, which provide insight on various GA-related topics, such as the basics of the General Assembly, citizen lobbying, and more. And then we also do have a General Assembly advocacy guide, which provides an overview of Virginia's legislative session for advocates. So a great resource for y'all as well. And this QR code will redirect you to our General Assembly Advocacy 101 page. We suggest that you bookmark or save this resource somewhere, as it'll be a helpful resource in the months to come. And I'm going to go ahead and put it in the chat right now as well. So just a second. All right. Perfect. Actually, okay, perfect. So then please check out these resources as well. So with that being said, this concludes our land use and transportation webinar as part of our Common Agenda Education series. So again, once again, I'd like to thank our speakers, Richard, Stephanie, and Brantley, for speaking today and going to depth into some of the key issues facing our Commonwealth. As a reminder, the recording of this webinar will be shared with registered attendees in the next few days. And then looking forward, our next webinar will take place next Wednesday, same time, so October 23rd, from 12 to 1:30, regarding the key or emerging issues from the climate and energy chapter of our 2025 Common Agenda. So in the meantime, if you have any questions whatsoever, please feel free to reach out to me, Jaime, at jaime@vcnva.org. And without further ado, thank you so much for everyone who was able to attend today, and have a great rest of your day.